Thank you very much for asking me. I explained to Keith earlier that I always feel a bit of a fraud when I come in here, which is pretty infrequently, the reason being that I have no academic respectability at all, along with many graduates of this place, one might say. But, no, I have no academic respectability at all. I'm just a journalist and I'm just interested in the subject. So, having said that, I will attempt to give you my take on why I find this period of our history particularly fascinating. I find it one of those events which we all think we know about, but actually I don't think we do know a great deal about. And we're labouring under a great number of misapprehensions about it, because I think that the way that this event is perceived is not as it was perceived either at the time or seemed at the time, but as it came to seem in various periods of political analysis after the event. These periods starting in the 1930s and continuing into the 1960s, and most famously, of course, and the subject of much rancor on the part of Michael Gove up to the age of Blackadder. You'll recall the famous scene in Blackadder where Stephen Fry, General Melchett, says to him, "Well, good luck," as he sends him over the top. "Good luck, Blackadder. I'll be right behind you." And Blackadder mutters under his breath, "Yes, about 35 miles behind." This idea that it was all innocent young men condemned to their death by boneheaded generals, lions led by donkeys, this idea has been around for a very long time. And I think a moment's thought will tell you that much of it doesn't really make sense. I have never yet come across a general who set out to throw away his army and therefore make it more likely that he would lose a battle. So there must be some other explanation. And the explanation I think that I come to is that nobody knew what they were dealing with. This was such an unprecedented event. Wasn't an unprecedented event, sorry, this august company. You can't be such an unprecedented, can you, Lucy? No. It was an unprecedented event. And nobody knew how to deal with it. That, I think, is the explanation. And the reason it interests me is that it, I think, is the event that makes modern Britain. It's the event out of which emerges a Britain, I think, that we can all recognise as one we see around us today. I'll start with this photograph, which is a family photograph that hung on the wall when I was growing up. The figure in the middle here, I don't know how easy it is to see with the lights on, but this fellow in the middle here, leaning on this sign saying, "Keep off the wet tar," is my great-uncle Charlie. I didn't know very much about him until I started trying to find out something about him. According to the 1911 census, he was a loom overseer in one of the woolen mills of West Yorkshire. So a working class lad. He was 22 at the time this photograph was taken. I guess it's taken in the autumn of 1914 because, as you can see, it's a sunny day. There are still some leaves on the trees. These men belong to different military units. They're all in training. He, incidentally, is a medic. If you were able to look, it's a rather low-res picture, but if you're able to see his shoulders, he has a red cross on each shoulder. He was in the Royal Army Medical Corps. But these soldiers belong to different units. They were all in training together. It is taken, I guess, in the autumn of 1914, possibly in the spring of 1915. It was certainly no later than that, because on August the 7th, 1915, he was dead. He died at Gallipoli, a singularly ill-conceived and particularly badly executed diversionary enterprise to attack Germany's ally Turkey and open another front, relieve pressure elsewhere. And so he died on August the 7th, 1915. So within less than a year of this photograph being taken, certainly, he was dead. I grew up with this photograph on the wall. He was, as it were, present absence or something or other in my life. I knew who he was. My children, because I've bored on about him and many others like him, they're vaguely aware of who he is. My mother went to find his name on the memorial on the Hellespont, where many British dead are commemorated. She found it. I haven't been. I won't go. My children certainly won't go, I think. So I think we're at the point where this has moved now from an event that is in family memory to an event that is in history. It nestles there quite comfortably among a set of assumptions and prejudices we all have about this event, which I don't think really will do. So what I want to do is to try to find out how it seemed at the time. And I'm talking here specifically about Britain. There are many distinguished speakers who will come later in the day who will give you a rather more broad international perspective. I'll talk about Britain because that's what I know about. When the war came in that August, it came completely out of the blue. I like this photograph. It shows three ladies sitting onto the beach under their parasols, and behind them, they apparently oblivious, a newsboy carrying a placard that says, "War declared, official." Now when it came completely unexpectedly. There were troubling clouds on the horizon, there's no doubt, but they were particularly around the issue of Irish Home Rule and what was to be done with the loyalists, as we now call them, in Northern Ireland and elsewhere, who refused to accept the idea of an independent Ireland. So trouble was expected of some kind, but no one expected it to be some damn fool thing in the Balkans. And it took everybody by surprise. The British Army, as you know, at the time was very, very small. An expeditionary force was dispatched to France to respond to the urgent pleas of the French government and the Belgian king, because the Germans had an invasion plan which necessitated transiting through Belgium and into France. They were quite well established pretty quickly. They were, whatever else you may think about the Germans, personally I have a great affection for them. They make pretty good soldiers, pretty good military machines. And so there were these desperate pleas for aid, and Britain, because it was a signatory of the 1839 Treaty of London, was called upon to do something to intervene, and for a combination of reasons, some of them noble and some of them, I think, self-interested, the British government decided there was no choice, there would have to be an intervention. These reasons, question of honour, I suppose. If you sign a treaty, you must be prepared to honour it, which is a great cautionary tale. I think a number of our leaders could do with learning that you shouldn't sign cheques that others have to honour. Secondly, there was a question, I suppose, of amour propre, that this was the major power in the world. If you wish to be taken seriously as a major power, and Obama has discovered this recently, if you wish to be taken seriously as a major power, you cannot decline to act when a threat is either made or implied. And thirdly, there was a question of self-interest. Had the Germans been successful in dominating Europe, they would have posed a really serious menace to British interests, which up to that point had been concerned essentially with ensuring that there was no great dominant power on the continent which would get into a position where it could menace British interests, which were predominantly much further overseas. So there was a combination of motives. A decision was taken that an expeditionary force had to be sent. The British Army, as I say, was very small. The expeditionary force when first dispatched was about 80,000 men. Now that is the size to which the current government proposes to reduce the British Army after the current cuts. It's about the number of people who can get into Wembley Stadium. There were not great available reserves which could have been sent. I mean, there were a couple of further divisions which could have been dispatched, and the force was augmented when it became clear that things were not going at all as anticipated. The British Army was a highly professional force. It was very small by comparison with continental armies, because for many centuries there had been an opposition to conscription. It was a volunteer force, it was a professional force, it was well trained. It had been in a number of imperial engagements. I mean, there was a war through every year of Victoria's reign, somewhere or other in the world, so it was pretty experienced at fighting, but it was experienced at fighting on dusty imperial battlefields. It was not prepared for what it encountered on the continent when it met this massive German force, and very quickly everything became bogged down in trench warfare. Trench warfare was not new to the First World War. There had been trenches employed on battlefields previously, but they had been essentially temporary things. They were tactical features of the battlefield, whereas in the First World War they became horribly permanent. So the first question was, how on earth? No, actually the first question was, who on earth is going to be War Secretary? There was no War Secretary at the time. The job was being discharged by the Prime Minister. Clearly, if you're embarking on a war, you need a War Secretary who's going to be responsible for it. There was one obvious choice, and that was this man in this photograph or portrait or sketch by the cartoonist Alfred Leet. And this was Kitchener. Kitchener, great imperial hero, veteran of wars all over the world, and a figure who was very, very publicly known. So he was actually, he'd been in London, coincidentally, receiving yet another gong. Viscountcy, I think it was. And when the war broke out, he immediately could smell, when war was imminent, he could smell a rat. He knew that he needed to get out of the country quick before he got given this job he didn't want. And he had got as far as the Channel coast, and he was on a Channel ferry, pacing about, asking the captain, why can't we go, why can't we go? Because he was unfamiliar with the idea that the Channel ferries waited the arrival of the boat train. The boat train eventually arrives, there's a messenger on it from Downing Street, telling him you have to go back to London because you're going to be made War Secretary. He goes back to London. He is appointed War Secretary, which obliges him to sit around the table with a bunch of politicians, a species he cordially loathes, almost as much as he loathes journalists. So he becomes War Secretary, and he immediately delivers himself of two lapidary observations. Firstly, that the war will last for years, rather than, as some were saying, although it wasn't, I think, the prevailing view that it would all be over by Christmas, but there were certainly some saying that. And he says it will last for years, he suggests about 3 years. And he secondly says it will be won by the last 1,000,000 men. This requires the country to raise a huge army. And this poster is merely one of many in which there is an attempt to appeal for volunteers. The reason, incidentally, his eyes seem to follow you around the room is that he's got a slight squint. Actually, it was worse than this in real life. That's why his eyes follow you around. But this was one of many posters attempting to persuade people to join the army, something that most British people did not want to do, which was one of the reasons the army was so small. So there were others. This one I like because it's straight patriotism, this one. Your country's call, isn't this worth fighting for? Enlist now. I like this one because the thatched cottages are clearly English and southern English, and the kilted soldier is clearly a Scotsman. So there's the straight appeal to patriotism. There are appeals like this, an appeal to masculinity, women of Britain saying go. And then there are appeals like this. Two children, one sitting at a man's knee, one on his lap, and a rather shifty-looking cove in a chair. Daddy, what did you do in the Great War? Do you want to be the sort of person who can be accused of having shirked what was seen as a national duty? So this is an appeal to people's consciences, and it was amazingly effective. There were Hundreds of thousands of young men volunteered in those months of August, September and October 1914. They volunteered by the hundred of thousands. I was writing a piece yesterday about the 2-minute silence and the sheer scale. That poppy exhibit at the Tower of London, I think the reason it's so effective is because you know that every one of those poppies represents a life. And when you look at the scale of engagement in this war, I was reading something about a broadcast on the first Armistice Day ceremony in which the broadcaster said, "Were the dead of the war to be formed up in a continuous column, 4 abreast, and to be marched past the cenotaph, the first rank of 4 would pass the cenotaph at the time the last rank of 4 was in Durham." Now this is a staggering, I think it's an amazing way of looking at it really, but very large numbers join as volunteers. Eventually, as you all know, conscription comes in January 1916, but very large numbers join in the autumn of 1914 and into 1915. They join in such large numbers that the machine is overwhelmed. They cannot be given uniforms. They do weapons training with broom handles or bits of drain pipe. They do map reading exercises without maps. The whole system is completely overwhelmed because there's such a great flood to the colours. It is, as you can see in this photograph, terribly easy to join an organisation. It's jolly difficult to leave. These are 3 young men swearing swearing the oath of allegiance. This is the recruiting officer, this is the recruiting sergeant. This is sometime in the autumn of 1914, early 1915. In order to enlist, you need merely to be, I think, 5'4" tall. You need to be able to inflate your chest to about 34 inches. I doubt there's a person in this room who can't inflate their chest to 34 inches. You need to have decent teeth. Dental condition, of course, being a great indicator of general health. Dentistry was not, as it is now, freely available, and many poor people had absolutely terrible teeth. Many were rejected on grounds of having poor teeth, leading some to ask, what are we supposed to do, bite the Germans? And of course there were some, famously, who were underage when they enlisted, and there were many who did so against the protests of their wives and mothers. But there was a collective enthusiasm. I'm reluctant to call it hysteria because I wasn't there, but there was a tremendous mass enthusiasm. It is often said that the PALS battalions are a very good example of that. The offer that an employer or a council or a newspaper or something could try to persuade young men that they should all join together and they'd all serve together, and the consequence, of course, the unfortunate consequence being that when that unit was then in action, the casualties were concentrated in a very, very narrow part of town very often, and there are numerous accounts of postboys and the like giving up their jobs because they simply couldn't bear being the deliverer of the letter telling people that their son was dead in combat. But the PALS battalions actually were a small part of the army. Most soldiers, when they joined up, joined existing military formations or expanded military formations. So they joined, and they joined for the duration very often, if they lasted that long. They joined an organisation, as I say, it was terribly hard to leave. The training involved them in learning, of course, how to dig trenches. This is a picture of a sergeant in the Lancashire Regiment. I think it's taken somewhere in Flanders because there are other places in Flanders where the water table is actually higher. So it was about a foot or two below the surface of the ground. So this isn't that bad a place to be. They didn't, generally speaking, spend the whole war in conditions like this. They were rotated through. One of the reasons I think the British Army did not suffer mutinies on the scale that the French or the German armies, or notably the Russian army, of course, suffered mutinies, was that they were rotated. So you would be sent up to the front line, you'd spend some days there, but they're appalling conditions, as you can see. Not all trenches were like this. Trenches on the Somme, for example, were largely dry because it's nice chalky ground. But in areas like Flanders, the conditions were absolutely terrible. By the time food was prepared in reserve trenches somewhere back down here, but by the time it got to the front, it was generally speaking cold. It was always monotonous. You can imagine what these places became like, with very, very large numbers of men in pretty close quarters. All daily functions had to be performed there, including going to the lavatory. There's a fantastic poem. I'm not going to quote any World War I poems because I imagine there are distinguished people who are going to do that later on. But there is a poem, I'll just give you one, which is from 1916, when a Scottish Regular Army General, Major General Cameron Shute, found himself in command of the Royal Naval Division. The Royal Naval Division was a very odd formation because in that great influx of young men into the armed services, there were many who felt that it was somehow more British to join the Navy than the Army. So the Navy was oversubscribed, so there was a Royal Naval Division formed, which was sailors who were to fight as infantry. However, they retained all the usual nautical traditions. They wore beards if they wanted to, for example. They requested leave by asking permission to go ashore from the trenches. And they were cordially loathed by many senior officers in the old regular army. Anyway, Major General Sir Cameron Shute found himself in charge of these people in 1916, and he came on a tour of inspection. After which A.P. Herbert, who was a lawyer and one of the Oxford MPs, in fact, in the days when there were university seats, after the war, he was a lieutenant in the Naval Division, and he wrote this poem, which goes, "The general inspecting the trenches exclaimed with a horrified shout, 'I refuse to command a division which leaves its excreta about.' But nobody took any notice. No one cared to refute that the presence of shit was congenial compared with the presence of shoot. And various responsible critics made haste to reply to his words, observing his senior advisers consisted entirely of turds. A shit may be shot at odd corners and paper supplied there to suit, but a shit would be shot without mourners if somebody shot that shit shoot." Squalid places. The trenches did not, they ran an enormous distance. They ran from the shores of the North Sea right down to the borders of Switzerland, I mean 450, 500 miles. They didn't tend to run in straight lines, they ran in zigzags because that way, if you got a shell blast, and artillery is the big killing weapon in the First World War, if you got a shell blast, it can't go right the way down the trench, and if the enemy get into the trench, they can't fire straight down the trench. So they tended to run in zigzags, but they were invariably pretty squalid, and there were enormous challenges in these circumstances as to how you maintain morale and how you cared for men who were, for example, wounded, because the danger of infection is, of course, huge. And one of the reasons for the terrible number of amputations that became necessary on the First World War battlefield was that it took a long time to realise, when it was realised it led to huge advances in medicine, it took a long time to realise that if someone was injured, you had to excise all the contaminated flesh, otherwise you got sepsis, gangrene, and people would have no option but to have their leg or arm amputated. So the challenges were huge living in these conditions. The advantage of a trench, of course, is that it gives you protection. As long as you're below ground level, you cannot be shot very readily. However, you are exposed to artillery fire because artillery can come over and just drop straight down as I say, that was the big killing weapon of the war. By late 1915, the scale of casualties caused was so great that the government was having to think about other ways of augmenting the forces. There is no reason for including this photograph at all, except that I rather like it. It's a wedding photograph. This young man has returned from the front. You can see by the fact he's got a wound stripe on his arm. The thing about it is they're so young. By late 1915, there have been so many young men killed or wounded that the government is having to reconsider whether it can rely any longer upon the idea of voluntary joining of the armed forces. And so in January 1916, conscription comes in. Now, I think there are an awful lot of myths about conscription, one of them being that conscientious objectors were shot. This is not true. There were no conscientious objectors who were shot for refusing to join the army. And I think when you look at the way it was conducted, although clearly we would find it absolutely unacceptable now, it seems to me to have been done in a reasonably humane fashion. The idea of objecting to military service on grounds of conscience was accepted. Now, it wasn't easy. I don't suggest it was easy. There were about 16,000 conscientious objectors. But it was accepted in this country. It was not accepted in Germany. It was not accepted in France. It was accepted in very, very few other places. There were other grounds on which you could decline to serve. You could decline to serve on the grounds that you were doing work which was of vital national importance. You could object to serving if your family had already paid a very high price. There are plenty of examples of mothers who appeared at tribunals and said, you know, I've already sent 5 boys to the front. Do I really have to send another one? There are also examples, of course, of people who tried it on. There was a young man in Leeds, for example, who tried to defer his military service until he completed his course of hair restoration. But you could object on grounds that you were doing work of national importance. And very often, and it varied, of course, because all the tribunals were made up on a very ad hoc basis, and they varied differently across the country. It depended very much upon where the tribunal was that you were appearing in front of. So, if you were up before a tribunal in Leicestershire, great hunting country, you could find some people who thought it was very, very important that the stock of horseflesh being maintained, and so you could be a groom or a stable lad, and you could claim that that was reason enough not to serve. Or there are cases on the south coast where people objected, and objected successfully to serving, on the grounds that they were bathing hut attendants, and a state of good health was essential to the well-being of the nation. But by 1916, as I say, it had been decided that you couldn't any longer rely upon volunteers of the kind that this young man was. By 1917, women who had played a very active role in war work were able to join something called the Women's Land Army. I don't know why I like this photograph, but it's taken in 1917. It's a sort of recruitment show for the Women's Land Army. I very much doubt that there were only 100,000 of them. I very much doubt that they wore this, which was their official uniform, the white smocks and the slouch hats. I very much doubt they wore them very much while they were tilling the fields. They'd get very mucky, I think. But there were women performing war work right from the start, from the very, very early days. Most of the munitions were made by women. There is an account by an army padre, Woodbine Willie, of watching a barrage, British barrage go in, and he notes it was a splendid sight. And to think that all of these shells were made by our girls. The hand that rocks the cradle wrecks the world. It's a chilling observation, I think. There had been children who'd been casualties of the war as early as December 1914. By 1915, if you live on the east side of Britain, you're vulnerable to Zeppelin attack. By 1916, there are German bombers, fixed-wing bombers coming over. There are children who are casualties of the war right from the start. So the picture that begins to emerge, I think, is of an entire nation. The first kind of war that involves virtually everybody. Almost no one is immune. No class of person, no condition of person, no age of person is immune from the threat posed by war. And I think that this has the effect of changing the relationship between government and citizen. From very early in the war, the government had felt entitled under the Defence of the Realm Act to restrict all sorts of freedoms which had previously been taken for granted. So there were all the obvious ones, like you couldn't light bonfires, you couldn't set off fireworks. There were attempts to control this country's absurd relationship with drink. Quite effective, actually. Intolerable now. But there were attempts by the government to interfere in every area of people's lives. And I think the consequence of the fact that so many people had been involved in the war effort, and I don't mean just men, meant that at the end of the war there was no alternative but to change the relationship between government and citizen. This is, I think, a really, really big change. I think a Victorian time traveller coming back to Britain in 1914 would have understood exactly how the country functioned. I think if they'd come back in 1924, I don't think they would. They'd have seen something that was almost unrecognisable. Now, admittedly, it was not a country that we would particularly want to live in now. For example, the extension of the franchise at the end of the war did not extend it on equal terms to women, but for the first time you do get some women voting. The government by then had become involved in the regulation of what people did with their time, what they paid in rent, what they were paid in wages. By 1917 they were involved, at the end of 1917 they were involved in what people ate. So every area of life really the government had started to intervene in. And this is a profoundly different relationship between government and government. And I think it lays the foundations for the sort of society that we live in today. As I say, I think the pre-war and the post-war social situation in this country was very, very different. Political situation anyway. The country had got used by 1918 to the sight of very large numbers of wounded, disabled men. This shows two men. There was a uniform for the wounded as well. Both these men are wearing it. This shows a double amputee in a wheelchair and a single amputee on crutches. Is it enforced jollity? I don't know. They're both smiling at the camera. It's a slightly troubling photograph, I think. But the reason casualties were so great was, as I suggest, because it took some while to realise what the really big killers were in the war. And part of it was to do with the fact that medicine took a while to catch up. So medicine changes during the course of the war, and those people who suffered mental injuries, shell shock as it was called, or as we now call it, post-traumatic stress disorders, those people discovered for the first time that there were people who were prepared to try to understand what was happening to them. And it takes years, and by 1930 there are still something like, I think, 30,000 men suffering from shell shock. horrible, horrible consequences, but the recognition that a mental wound was as bad as a physical wound, when in the early days of the war you were just held to be a malingerer. The particular area that fascinates me is facial wounds, because we tend to consider plastic surgery now so much as an act of vanity that we fail to recognize, I think, that at this time it was a real sanity saver. There were, for example, on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, no fewer than 2,000 men sent back to Britain with facial wounds. Now, facial wounds could be incurred in a number of ways. Obviously, if you put your head up above the top of a trench, you expose it to enemy fire, but many of them are victims of, or were victims of, artillery blast, because an artillery blast was just as likely to get you in the face as in the testicles or the stomach or the arms or the legs. And these men returned to this country. I'm not going to show you photographs of them, they're rather distressing. They returned to this country horribly facially disfigured, and some of them never left the hospital that they went back to. They went to wards where mirrors were banned because it was too distressing to see what you looked like, where they dreaded the arrival of their family because of the danger that their children would run away in horror. Some of them were trained as cinema projectionists. Was a very popular trade to be trained as, because that way you arrived at the cinema before everybody else, you left after everybody else, and you spent the entire day in a darkened room. Many of them stayed at the hospitals for as long as they lived. I met someone about 6 months ago who actually saw one of these men. She grew up in Kent, and her parents had an arrangement with a man who lived in a caravan that they could rent a pony that she would ride on Sundays. And whenever she went to the caravan, the man only ever appeared at the half door. It was one of those kind of stable door arrangements. He only ever appeared in profile. And one time when she went to pay him the 2 and 6 or whatever it was, he turned that way and she saw the whole of the rest of his face was missing. This was a terrible thing to live with. He was wearing something which actually didn't last very long. He was wearing some masks, which were the early solution before plastic surgery. But plastic surgery became a way of rebuilding not just a physical aspect of somebody's body, but rebuilding a personality, because, you know, a person without a face is a person without an identity, I suppose. So the country is completely changed by the end of the war. The last few days of the war is relatively simply told, I think. The Germans stage a big offensive in the spring of 1918, and it falters at the last minute. They throw everything they have into it, including lots of half-trained young men who've been recruited in Germany, and they're in pretty poor physical condition, many of them. But the offensive falters at the last minute, and in the space of 100 days after that, the Allied offensive, the Allied counterattack, destroys the Germans. 100 days, it's amazing after so many years of war. But the Germans basically collapse. And then comes the armistice in November 1918. This is a photograph taken in St. James's Park of children playing aboard a captured German guns. There were 3 days of riotous celebration in London. Celebrations right across the country. The question of remembrance actually happened a year later. It comes in after the treaty at Versailles, which of course is what stores up such enormous problems. But I think in the way that the war is remembered, we tend to forget that it was won. It was won at awful cost, but it was won. And by and large, the British people kept faith with the war, right to the end, despite extreme provocation and great hardship. And that, I think, is too little appreciated. Then you get the setting after that of remembrance and the creation of this, the 2-minute silence and the familiar act of remembrance, which will happen this Sunday. It got standardized on the nearest Sunday to Armistice Day long after the war. It used to be celebrated on the actual anniversary of the armistice, but there came a point when, by the 1930s, mass observation is talking about people thinking this thing is largely redundant and irrelevant. The end of the war, there were 750,000 roughly British dead, 880,000 British in the Commonwealth, and the nature of the country had changed hugely, I think. And perhaps the scale of that loss was one of the things that made people so eager to embrace the idea of appeasement in the 1930s, that this was a real horror for everybody. There were, in 1918, 16,000 villages in England and Wales. There were 40 out of 16,000, to which everybody who had gone off to war returned.